So, good evening and welcome to our first faculty book talk of the spring semester. Before introducing the speaker, I'm going to mention some upcoming events. First of all, we have a couple more book talks this semester. You'll see them in the flyers. Then at the Kislak at Richter Library on March 28th, we'll have our last Stanford lecture of the academic year, featuring Francois Reconati, a French philosopher, who will speak on imagination in the self. More information on that can be found on our website. We have a sign-up sheet going around, and if you're not on our mailing list and want to be, you can also put your email address there. I'll note that the book is on sale out there if you want to pick up a copy and get it signed at the end. And finally, I'll remind all of you to silence your cell phones if you've not done so already. So I'll switch from my hat as director of the Humanities Center to my hat as introducer of tonight's speaker. And I'll start with a question. What did the English novelist Barbara Pym, noted for her works on the English middle class, and Saul Bellow, the brash American Nobel Prize-winning author, and Ursula Guin, one of the leading science fiction writers of all time, and Eduardo Glissant, the influential Martinican anti-colonial intellectual, have in common? Now, if you'd asked me about this not very long ago, I would have said, I have no idea. But it turns out there's a good answer. And that answer can be found, spoiler alert, and the subtitle here, Literature and Anthropology in the Mid-Century Atlantic World. The famous anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who also makes an appearance in this book, famously wrote that animals are not only good to eat, but to think, or as it's often translated, to think with. As it turns out, anthropology is good to write fiction with, and fiction is good to write anthropology with. Most scholars have dated the rich interaction between the activities of anthropology and fiction writing to the 1970s, but in this book, Tim combines careful and intelligent reading of a large number of works by a variety of authors with a deep command of the history of anthropology and of the decline of empire, to show how that encounter was very common a generation earlier, both in Anglophone and Francophone writing. This book has already received a good deal of attention and has been described as, quote, full of splendid insight and erudition, end quote, and as a, quote, brilliant new history of the decolonizing of metropolitan anthropology, end quote. As for the speaker, well, Tim received his BA from Cambridge University, his MA from the University of Sussex, and his PhD from Columbia University. He taught at Princeton University before coming to the University of Miami, and for his, no doubt, manifold sins, has been chair of the English department here for the last year and a half. He has received a number of grants and fellowships, presented numerous papers in the U.S. and the U.K., as well as France, Germany, Ireland, Jamaica, Barbados, and Bermuda. I'm only a little bit jealous. And published many articles, reviews, and other scholarly pieces. In 2011, he published his first monograph, Caribbean Culture and British Fiction in the Atlantic World, 1780 to 1870. And I understand he and a colleague are coming out with another edited book next year on Caribbean literature. However, we are here today to hear more about his most recent book, and so I'll turn the podium over to Tim.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you everybody for coming here today. I have to say, this is the most nervous I've been about giving a presentation in many, many years. Even though, or maybe because, there are so many friends and so many friendly faces and colleagues and all teachers of my son and just about everybody here in the room. And so I'm trembling with fear, but I'm happy and honored to be here. I've sat here many times and applauded my colleagues and celebrated their work. I'd be much happier to be sitting in the audience. Maybe actually we should just go outside to the courtyard, have a drink, come back at 7 o'clock on Saturday and listen to Marlon James. But no. Thank you to Books and Books. It is an honor to be here. This is a legendary bookshop, and rightly so, that's catalyzed and nurtured a book reading and book buying community in Miami, and is truly one of the very best things about this city. Thank you also to the indispensable Center for the Humanities at the University of Miami, to its previous director, Mihoka Suzuki, who encouraged, I think that's the word, me, despite my reluctance to do this talk, and is in Washington, D.C. at the Folger Shakespeare Library doing research right now. And to the current director, Hugh Thomas, thank you for that very generous introduction, Hugh, and for your fine stewardship of this vital organization, the Center for the Humanities. Thanks to Meg Homer, to Oni Dunham, and to Carrie Leanne Taylor, and all the staff of the Center. Thank you to all of you for being here, for caring about scholarly work in the humanities, for caring about books and ideas. At one of these events a number of years ago, and the colleague I'm about to mention is here today, but I won't name them, I'm ashamed to say I asked a colleague a very tough, ungenerous question at a similar event. If that happens tonight, after the event, I thoroughly have earned and deserved that. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. This is a book talk and not a book launch. The book came out in March 2018. My publishers won't like me saying this, but the book is only in hardcover and it costs $74. And so I completely understand if that's more than you're prepared to ever pay for a book. And you could buy 3 copies of Black Leopard Red Wolf for that amount, just incidentally. How does a book begin? How far back should we go in order to think about where a book starts? This one began a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Brooklyn. My PhD dissertation, as you said, I was living in New York at the time. My dissertation was about the idea of the end of the British Empire. And it was called The Sun Also Sets. And I'm still very attached to that title, even though most of the dissertation never saw the light of day. I reused the title in one of the chapters of this book. So dissertations do have a kind of afterlife, and even 2 or 3 paragraphs from that dissertation did end up in this book. But that moment, the moment of the end of the empire, the moment of the formal unraveling of the British Empire, was the end of my dissertation. Despite the fact that unraveling took place in spectacular and violent fashion after World War II, after the partition of India in 1947, people in Britain, which was my focus at the time, discussed it remarkably little. The historian, in the 19th century English historian John Seeley, famously said that Britain had acquired its empire in a fit of absence of mind, and it seemed to lose its empire in a similar fashion. There were, despite the violence, despite the unraveling, there was surprisingly little public discussion about decolonization in Britain itself. The British told themselves a story, and if you're following the news, you'll know that many still continue to tell themselves the same story. A story of benevolent continuity, a story of an empire peacefully turning itself into a commonwealth of nations. What was discussed, if the empire wasn't discussed, was the arrival in Britain, let's see if this can work, of tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands of migrants from the British Caribbean colonies in the late 40s on the Empire Windrush, and then subsequently throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The discussion was complicated and wide-ranging in Britain at the time, and many of the people who took part in that discussion on the British side and were prominent in it were in fact anthropologists. So there are 2 or 3 famous, well, in British anthropology circles, reasonably well known, books about West Indian migrants in Britain in the 40s and 50s by relatively prominent British anthropologists. Kenneth Little wrote the first of these books in 1948. It was called Negroes in Britain. It was about a black community in the Welsh port town of Cardiff. Michael Banton wrote a book called The Coloured Quarter about Stepney in East London. And Sheila Patterson wrote a book called Dark Strangers. Now you can tell from the titles here that there was some discomfort, but at the same time these were intellectuals who saw themselves as welcoming of another book of the same period was called The Newcomers. They saw themselves as liberal-minded, which they certainly were, and they saw the arrival of West Indian migrants as a moment of Britain allowing people to come and help rebuild, to provide labor, and despite the fact that there were significant tensions in Britain, anthropologists, for the most part, adopted a kind of welcoming position. Many of these anthropologists who wrote about Britain also wrote anthropological monographs of Africa, different locations in Africa. Little, certainly, Banton, certainly, Patterson also. So the caption on this photo is in fact legally not accurate. West Indians in the 1950s were not immigrants in Britain. They were migrants. They were citizens of the UK and colonies. And there was technically no border, no national border between Britain and its Caribbean colonies at this time. So they weren't immigrants, they were migrants. But that's apparently the caption that was used on this well-known photograph that appeared in Picture Post in the 1950s. The repercussions of that moment continue today. I mean, literally today. There was a deportation flight from Britain to Jamaica where people who are either descendants of early migrants who came often without some kind of documentation because they didn't need that documentation because they were citizens. The children of those migrants, some are now being deported in what's called the Windrush scandal in Britain. So the ramifications of this continue. There were other examples of anthropologists in Britain in this period, turning their gaze to Britain itself. Right? Anthropology historically had taken place outside the metropole, certainly in the British and the French context. So another well-known work of this period, Family and Kinship in East London, was a book jointly authored by Michael Young, who was actually the author of the Labour Party manifesto of 1945 that brought in the welfare state. He and his co-author lived in the East End of London for a year and wrote an ethnography of English working class communities in East London. And you can tell from the title, Kinship, that there were anthropological analyses embedded in this work. So I became interested in anthropologists who turned their gaze home, right, who brought anthropology back, as it were, to the mainland. But despite that, and despite the cosmopolitan and open-minded nature of much of this work, there wasn't a great deal of reflection on anthropology's potential complicity with empire or with the practice of empire itself. It took a figure like a contemporary figure from the 1950s, like Chinua Achebe, to bring that connection home. So those of you who've read Things Fall Apart will remember that the district commissioner, who is a grotesque figure of authoritarian power at the end of that novel, is also an anthropologist, very, very importantly, right? He collects stories of the people that he calls the primitive peoples of the Lower Niger. And the fact that he writes a kind of anthropology, a sort of amateur anthropology, and combines that with colonial power is very important for Achebe. But British anthropologists, for the most part, are not making that same kind of connection. It took a writer to do that. So that's a long way of saying that 30 years ago, some of these questions were percolating for me. But that wasn't a book, right? That was an idea. How do I get from that moment of research, to the larger questions that I ask in this book? Let's think about what some of those larger questions are. If you think about these phrases, the historical novel, literary history, those seem like common sense phrases, right? There doesn't seem to be any question that the disciplines of the practice of literature and the disciplines and the practice of history belong together in some not an uncomplicated way, but it seems like common sense. The anthropological novel, literary anthropology, those terms are clearly less familiar to us. It's not that they don't exist, they do exist, they make sense to us, but they're not part of our common sense. Now, why is that? Why would it be that history and literature belong together when literature and anthropology don't, given the fact that literature and anthropology have been entwined and embedded and have given gifts to each other since before anthropology was a discipline? And I can give some kind of scholarly examples from the period that Hugh mentioned, the 70s and into the 80s. The idea of thick description, taken from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, has been deeply influential in literary studies. Has helped to decenter the canonical literary text and embed that cultural work in a wider context of cultural objects. From the other side, the idea of the literariness of anthropological writing, and in particular the work writing culture, an anthology that came out in the mid-1980s that focused on the poetics and the politics of ethnography. It initiated what some anthropologists, and I know there are some anthropologists here, and they may correct my history because I'm sure I am not an expert, I will get things incorrect, but the idea of a literary turn in anthropology has become itself a part of the discipline's own history. But the dialogue between literature and anthropology goes much, much further back than that. Even before, as I said, the modern idea of the discipline of anthropology began towards the end of the late 19th century. And in a way, it's not really surprising if you think about the dual meaning of the term culture, at least in English. The arts, on the one hand, but also the customs and the practices of a group of people on the other. And so that dual meaning of culture encapsulates, to some extent, the connections between the two disciplines. So, especially since the beginning of the 19th century, and a turn in literature towards descriptions of ordinary people. Writers and anthropologists have had similar methods and aims, you could say. The observation and description of people in the context of the groups that they belong to, families, social classes, racial and ethnic groups, nations even. Both have adopted what we might call an insider's outside perspective. Inside enough to see and describe things from a protagonist or a character's point of view, but outside enough to see and describe patterns that might not be apparent to the person, the character, the protagonist themselves. As Bronislaw Malinowski put it in one of the founding texts of anthropology, the goal of the anthropologist is, quote, to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. We have to study man, and we must study what concerns him most intimately, that is, the hold which life has on him. That's the end of the Malinowski quote. To do that requires not only scientific detachment, but also imagination. And this is Malinowski again. Imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach, close to a native village, while the launch or dinghy which has brought you sails away out of sight. So that moment of arrival, the anthropologist arriving, is also a moment of imagination that requires imagination. And Malinowski made his literary ambitions clear in a famous declaration in a letter where he dismissed one of the leading figures of the previous mode of anthropology. He said, Rivers, W.H.R. Rivers, is the Rider Haggard of anthropology. I shall be the Conrad. So, and it's true. In the modernist period, this is the 1920s, in the modernist period, in the first half of the 20th century, there were indeed all kinds of exchanges and conversations and borrowings between literature and anthropology. There was a lot of traffic back and forth between the two. Those of you who have had to study the footnotes of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland will know that he borrowed extensively, but somewhat loosely, from anthropologists of his age. James Clifford famously talked about the mode of ethnographic surrealism in Paris in the interwar period. You could think about Picasso and Braque's use of African masks and figures. And although anthropologists went along with imperialists, and I mean they literally went along with them, right? They didn't always see eye to eye with imperialists. They were skeptical Conrads for the most part, rather than the boosterish Rider Haggards of the world. And anthropology in this earlier period, in the period before World War II, in the earliest phase of its institutionalization, remained more open than many disciplines to colonial, colonized, and minority intellectuals, and to women, and to Jews. In Haiti, Jean Price-Mars and Jacques Roumain, and Roumain was a writer, also a novelist also. In Cuba, Fernando Ortiz, also a writer. In Britain, Malinowski and Lucy Mayer and Jomo Kenyatta, and briefly Kwame Nkrumah even began work for an anthropological degree at LSE. In the United States, Franz Boas and his students, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Catherine Dunham, and Zora Neale Hurston. So anthropology was reasonably open despite its latter-day reputation as being complicit with empire. So while and Hurston is an interesting figure, right? So while Malinowski's you imagine yourself alone. You're alone on a native beach, on a beach, but there's a village right next to you, but you're alone, right? Hurston begins her 1930s literary ethnography, Mules and Men, this way. First place I aimed to stop to collect material was Eatonville, Florida. She identifies her childhood home as the first fieldwork site for her research in African American folktales. And then she goes on, and now I'm going to tell you why I decided to go to my native village first. My native village, right? This is Hurston. A sly but a direct rebuke to Malinowski and all the other anthropological scenes of arrival and first contact. Here, the native village is the one that actually produced the anthropologist, not the site of the anthropologist. Well, it is the site of fieldwork, but it's also the site that produced the anthropologist in the first place, the ultimate inside-outsider. Hurston is perhaps a finest example, and I do write about Mules and Men a little bit in the introduction to this book, of the writer-anthropologist. Many scholars have looked to her as a leading figure in this group of pre-World War II connections between literature and anthropology. But after World War II, something changed. And that's what my book is about. It's about the period of the late 40s and the 1950s and into the early 1960s. Exchanges between literature and anthropology, not that they were ever easy or straightforward, but they became harder. Why? They became rarer. Why? And those exchanges that did take place became potentially more significant, therefore. What form did they take? Okay. So, as you said, there are many different and quite disparate writers and books that I write about in this book, and some of them are here on this slide. So, in a nutshell, I argue that as anthropology became more professionalized, more embedded in universities and museums in the period after World War II. So, for instance, the membership of the American Anthropological Association went from 1,300 to 3,000 in the 3 years at the end of the 1940s. Right? So suddenly there were a lot more academic jobs. There were a lot more anthropologists. It was a lot more professionalized. So as it became more embedded in institutions, and as it became more aligned with the new Cold War neo-colonial call, and this is true across the Atlantic world, for technical and scientific skills. Some anthropologists were happy to go along, and some, a smaller number, registered their dissent with the way the discipline was going, and that dissent, I argue, took a literary form, because that was an available means, an available form to register a certain discomfort with the use of anthropology in what came to be called soft power. So some of them experimented with literary techniques, and as Hugh mentioned, I do spend some time discussing Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques, which appeared in the 1950s and then was translated into English a few years later. And this is one of our most striking and continues to be an influential text about the relationship between literature and anthropology. Susan Sontag wrote an essay in the New York Review of Books in the 1950s that was called "The Anthropologist as Hero." Levi-Strauss was a kind of a cultural hero for someone like Sontag at that moment. The book Tristes Tropiques has also been very influential in literary studies via Frederick Jameson's use of Levi-Strauss's analysis of the Caruveo body art, which Levi-Strauss describes as a way that this group in Brazil were able to manage real contradictions in social and political contradictions in their life in the aesthetic realm, through the realm of art. That argument has filtered into literary analysis and been very influential, so that we've all spent a lot of time looking for the embedded and knotty contradictions that produce a particular kind of literary text. We can trace that back to Levi-Strauss. So I write a little about Tristes Tropiques in the introduction. I also write about other figures, some of whom you see up here. A lesser known, but to my mind just as interesting figure, Laura Bohannon, who's an American anthropologist who moved to Oxford in the 1950s for her PhD, and who carried out fieldwork in northern Nigeria and wrote academic articles based on this fieldwork, but also wrote a semi-autobiographical novel called Return to Laughter. And you'll see the two, you can't really see it very well, but the two first editions of that novel are on the right-hand side of the slide here. It was reprinted, the one at the top, as with the title "An Anthropological Novel," which is, as I said, fairly rare. Thank you. Right, and she published it under a pseudonym to begin with, which suggests that within the discipline of anthropology, there was certainly a kind of injunction against fictionalizing your fieldwork in this way. The book has been, it's never gone out of print. It's been assigned in fieldwork and methodology classes in anthropology departments, but hardly ever been discussed by literary scholars up to now. I write about literary moments in otherwise more conventional anthropological writing. So Mary Douglas, for instance, her first monograph is about the Congo, and she did her fieldwork in Congo just before the Belgians left, or were driven out, or the end of Belgian rule. And she crucially made the decision when she published the monograph to switch from what has come to be called the ethnographic present tense, the kind of timeless present tense in which we describe the customs and the practices of a particular group. She switched to the past tense, which is what a novelist might do, to describe scenes and practices which she recognized might well not be intact at this point. I talk about a UNESCO handbook that Margaret Mead wrote, and the literariness of that. On the Francophone side, which I guess I'm going to talk about a little bit less tonight, I talk about Michel Léris, who was a figure from the 30s, who was a writer who was taken along on one of the most famous French anthropological expeditions across the central belt of Africa in the 1930s. I write about the book he wrote in the 50s about his visit to Martinique and Guadeloupe, which begins as a kind of ethnographic survey of the middle classes, mostly of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and in the end turns into a kind of, almost despite itself, a kind of novel of social manners. But I'm not just interested in anthropologists who use literary techniques, right? In a sense, my book is two books rolled into one. Actually, it's probably more than that. I'm also interested in writers, literary writers, who received some kind of professional training in anthropology or are affiliated or associated with anthropological institutions in some way, and use that in their fiction. So again, as you mentioned and as you see here towards the bottom left, I have a chapter that partly deals with Saul Bellow's extremely weird novel from the mid-1950s called Henderson the Rain King, which is kind of a parody of anthropological travel in Africa, but also I claim, I'm not sure most Bellow scholars are going to agree with me, but I claim that it's actually seriously indebted to the anthropological training that Bellow received as a student of Melville Herskowitz's at Northwestern, and then when he began a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which he then dropped out of because he decided to become a writer. I talk about Edouard Glissant, the uncategorizable Martinican writer, and I argue that one of his early works, which actually isn't on here but should be, Soleil de la Conscience, which is Sun of Consciousness, is a kind of prose poem which is also a kind of ethnography of Paris, kind of anthropology of Paris in the 1950s. Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin is perhaps a surprising figure to see here. This was one of Ursula Le Guin. She's not even on the cover. This is one of the very first of Le Guin's publications. There's a short story in Fact and Science Fiction, Amazing Stories from 1964, I think. The Dowry of Angia. This later became the prologue to her very first published novel, Rocannon's World. Why is Ursula Le Guin here? Bohannon is a striking and an unsettling portrait of an anthropologist in Empire. If most anthropologists were not carrying out that kind of inquiry about their own complicity, Le Guin was in her fiction. Le Guin was Alfred Kroeber's daughter, so she grew up in an anthropological household. He was one of the pioneers and leading figures of American anthropology. Bohannon is the director of the first ethnographic survey of Fomalhaut II, which is a planet which you probably haven't visited. He's a noble and an ethical scientist. If I go back to, I don't know if you can read it at the top. Wherever he went, his super science made him a legendary figure. So his super science was anthropology. He's someone who, I'm not joking when I say he's noble and ethical. He respects the ways of all the life forms that he encounters. He learns from them. In fact, eventually he has an interspecies marriage and moves to the planet. I mean, you know, he goes native in a way. But he's also a warrior. He's also a kind of imperial adventurer. He worries about his role as a kind of advance guard for the League of All Worlds, LAW, the law, and with its technological superiority. On the other hand, he doesn't hesitate to call in an airstrike when it's necessary to destroy the rebels. So that ambiguous representation of the anthropologist, and that's not the only one in Le Guin's novels, but it's the most striking. So I think Le Guin is an important figure here. And finally, I probably have spoken for too long, and some of my colleagues have heard me talk already about Barbara Pym, but perhaps the most unlikely figure of all in here is Barbara Pym, and her 1955 novel Less Than Angels is on the top row there. This is the second origin story for my book. at the previous institution that I taught at least 15 years ago, it takes a really long time for me to write a book, right? I called this project the 1950s book. That's all it was for me at that point. I tell anyone who would listen that the 1950s were this underappreciated decade. With the epic tragedies of the 1940s and the Second World War, the revolutionary upheavals of the 1960s, and in between there was the 50s, and nobody talked about them or knew how to describe them, or especially in the British case, they talked about a consensus of the 1950s as everybody agreed with everybody else. But that doesn't make much sense in the US context, but certainly in Britain, that's what we heard. So I would go around saying the 1950s were much more interesting and much more contentious than you think. And luckily for me, a graduate student named Wendy Lee heard about this project that I was working on, and she said to me, "You should read Barbara Pym." And I said, "No, you're kidding me, right?" Barbara Pym, had never read Barbara Pym, so that didn't stop me from having an opinion, of course. Who read Barbara Pym? What I knew about Barbara Pym was that she was a middle-brow, cozy, boring novelist of manners who described kind of nostalgic England from the point of view of the 50s that looked back to a moment when everyone went to church and had tea with the vicar. And she does write about all of those things, but she's not at all cozy, in fact. And so I thank Wendy, the graduate student, for putting me on to Barbara Pym, because in fact she writes about England with an ethnographic and an anthropological eye, for sure. She writes about an England in the throes of significant social change, with the creation of a new welfare state, with migration and with the end of empire. But she does it through an ethnographic description of English middle-class women, mostly. She talks about church women's meetings, rectories, and jumble sales, rummage sales. And this home anthropology in Pym is hiding in plain sight. Her novels are full of anthropologists. It'll come as no surprise to the academics in the audience, and include all the academics here, and I know there are quite a few, to find that the intellectuals in Pym's world have many of the same foibles as their less high-minded peers. They squabble, they fall in and out of love, they're petty, they try to undermine each other, etc., etc. There are many anthropologists who play those roles in her novels. In Less Than Angels, which is the novel here, and Excellent Women, her best-known novel, Pym draws on her other life, her day job. For 30 years, Barbara Pym worked as an editor, as a compiler of linguistic surveys, and as the all-round staff person at the International African Institute in London, the premier site of in the Atlantic world for the anthropology of Africa. All anthropologists of Africa would come through the IAA at some point. She edited their work, she edited their books, she edited their journal articles, and then she turned them into characters in her novels. So Laura Bohannon appears in her novel, passingly, along with her American husband Paul, who Laura wrote out of her novel. He disappears completely from the scene, which is interesting. The French ethnographic modernist filmmaker Jean Rauch is in Pym's novels as a visiting French anthropologist who's fascinated by the customs of the English suburbs. Her longtime boss, Darrell Ford, who was a diehard functionalist who thought about kinship diagrams, he appears as Felix Mannering, the director of the African Library. So this most English of writers, this comedies of social manners, turn out to be rich and significant venues for thinking about the ongoing conversation between literature and anthropology in the period of decolonization. Right, so I'm coming back to my original impulse for this book, which is to think about Britain at the end of empire and to think about how the British thought about it or refused to think about it or talked about the fact that they were not thinking about it. And Pym is one of the ways that they do that. I probably talked for long enough. Let me show you the last slide. I did some archival work. I went to the papers of the International African Institute, which are held at the library in the London School of Economics, and there's a file. There's a Barbara Pym file. It's not surprising. She worked there for 30 years. Since becoming, as Hugh said, for my sins, I have been the chair of the English department for a year and a half now. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot are the ephemera, the files, the stories, the events that involve retiring staff members or faculty members who write a book and then talk about it, or write a grant and the grant transforms things, but what happens to the documentation, right? Mostly we're really bad at keeping that material. It seems ephemeral to us even in the moment. One or two of these things from Barbara Pym's 30 years of work at the IAI did survive. This is an invitation list for Barbara's party. This was her retirement party in 1974. She was ill with cancer at this point and was about to move to Oxfordshire. And she asked for all of these people to be invited. And in fact, I don't recognize all of the names, but many of the names of prominent anthropologists of Africa are on this list. So Mary Douglas is on the list. She had a long-term friendship with Mary Douglas, who's well known to many non-anthropologists because of her work Purity and Danger. M.G. Smith, the distinguished Jamaican anthropologist, is on this list. Lucy Mayer, one of the pioneers of British anthropology. I.M. Lewis, who edited the premier journal of British anthropology, Man, for 15 years, is on this list. Peter Lloyd. Peter Lloyd is not a well-known anthropologist, but he was one of Barbara Pym's obsessions, and he was turned into a figure in Tom Mallow's in one of her novels. So there are many prominent anthropologists here. This document in itself it's not very interesting, and in fact it looks like Mary Douglas wasn't able to make the party, which is unfortunate, right? There's a cross against her name towards the bottom. But instead of ending with a flourish, I'm going to end with this little archival document that suggests that these are ongoing and difficult conversations between literature and anthropology, and we may find them in unlikely places like this. Okay, thank you. Now, let's go and have a drink. No, not yet. I will. Dominique is going to ask the first question.
Well, you're a tease, so there are so many things to ask. I'm going to ask 3 things, and you answer whatever you want.
3 things, okay.
First is about the picture, 1956. And we've talked about 56 before. If it had been 1920, would it have been Margaret? Just a quick question. Is this a sign of a knowledge that the empire is dying and that maybe legally they're not immigrants, but the empire is dying? Just a quick question. Second question was about the Norman Rush and mating. You were talking about this Brooklyn guy who's thinking about all this stuff, and it's coming out in the literature and the novels about thinking about anthropology and literature. And I was wondering if Rush is part of some of the percolation of this. And then the third quick question was about how anthropology affected literature. So we were hearing a lot of this. I'm wondering about first person and third person, does this turn into a really nice device of how you get to switch back and forth between I arrive on the island with the natives and they think this or he feels that? Is this, I don't know if you see, just whatever you want to answer.
Well, I can answer the second question easily because I don't know, because I haven't read Norman Rush.
Okay, well, perfect.
But whenever I talk about the project, or whenever I talk about writers who are interested in anthropology or the other way around, people continually tell me about other writers or other anthropologists.
And you refuse to read the book.
No, I add it to the stack of books that I haven't read, and now I have another one, or 3 or 4 to add. But I mean, for instance, there were several writers who I thought about including but didn't. Gary Snyder. I decided that this had to focus on the Atlantic world. I couldn't. It was already too much, really, with the Francophone world and the Anglophone Atlantic world. But Snyder, very distinguished Pacific-facing poet also has a PhD in anthropology and is very, very anthropologically oriented. So to think about the beat poets and anthropology would have been a great project that I couldn't take on. So there are certainly many other. I haven't read much Vonnegut, but Vonnegut also was trained in anthropology. So these conversations were happening in many different places. So the answer to the second question is I don't know. The first question, would you're saying if that photograph of West Indians arriving at Victoria Station was taken in the 20s, would it be captioned differently?
As migrant instead of immigrant.
Well, there were fewer arriving at that time. I'm not sure that either of those words would have been chosen, probably. But it's more likely that migrant would have been seen as an appropriate term then. I mean, towards the end of the 1950s, you begin to see racist attacks. You see, explicit forms of racist violence, and then partly as a result, you see the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, which closes the door on most migration from the Caribbean at that moment. So, in a way, the picture post caption is pointing to what's about to come, or what's already underway. Yeah. The third question. I mean, I think that question is too broad for me to answer in a concise way, but I mean, I do think that the form of what literary scholars call free indirect discourse is one way that ethnographic approaches can be used formally within fiction, so that you get a perspective which is both inside and outside, and you do that through the kind of the syntactical form of free indirect discourse, right? A moment that is inside the perspective of a character, but still viewed from the outside. So that's third person, but not quite, right? It's somewhere between first person and third person. Don.
Tim, thank you for the very thoughtful presentation. As I sat back here and listened, I was wondering, have you concluded that, I mean, you talked about the linkage between literature and anthropology, but weren't you also refuting disciplinary boundaries? I mean, I sat here as a historian, and almost every person you mentioned I thought was crucial to history writing. You mentioned Franz Boas, you mentioned Melville Herskovitz. Nobody can write in African American history and not use the Negro past. You mentioned Zora Neale Hurston. You can't do a history of Harlem. And I thought about the great W.B. Du Bois and his PhD from Harvard. He worked with Hart. He's definitely trained as a historian. And years later, when they asked him, what was he said he was a sociologist. So I'm wondering, these people you're talking about, aren't they perhaps bigger than their disciplines? And their ideas are bigger than their disciplines. And if that's the case, could a historian write the same book with the same people and say their importance to history writing?
Yeah, I think certainly with the figures that you mentioned. No, absolutely.
I'm trying to pin you down to see if you're arguing that we should be beyond disciplinary boundaries.
Should be, or sometimes yes. I think I mean, look, I wouldn't have written a book like this if I didn't want to be thinking across disciplinary boundaries. But in order to do that, I had, to the extent that it was possible, to take the disciplinary history of anthropology seriously and think about the history of that discipline in its own terms to the extent that I could, and that was difficult. And in fact, the book has only had one review so far, and it was by an anthropologist, and he really didn't like it. And, I thought it was ungenerous, but I could understand. I thought it was claiming turf, and at the same time, I'm sure that there are things that I didn't get. One thing I'll note is that the figures that you mention are from the first half of the century. Think about what happens to Hurston after the 30s and the 40s. She disappears. I mean, she actually doesn't disappear, but her writing is not well known. She is neglected, and it's only later when Alice Walker revives interest in her work that she becomes the figure that she is now. So that in the period that I'm talking about, Hurston was living in poverty in Miami during some of that period, right, and was not well known. So as an example of a figure who was able, in however, through the force of her personality and through the institutional connections she was able to make make some of those, to bridge some of those divides in the 20s and 30s. But in a later period, I'm not sure that would. I mean, that's part of my argument, that in the 50s that was less likely. And so that's why there are fewer minority and colonized anthropologists in this period. And then it changes again. So that in the 1970s you get a figure like Talal Assad talking about anthropology and the colonial encounter, and that changes the way that the discipline thinks about itself. And then the epilogue of my book deals with Amitav Ghosh and with Erna Brodber, the Jamaican novelist, who's also who turns a kind of composite figure of Zora Neale Hurston and Katherine Dunham into the protagonist of her novel Louisiana. So, in a later period, some of these exchanges become possible and rich again. I'm interested in this moment where they were continuing, but were more difficult. And that's partly because. Well, no, I'll stop there. I see another hand, Pam.
Well, first, thanks a lot for a really engaging, enjoyable conversation, talk. Obviously, you're conversing at us, right? So, and I'm very tired.
Me too.
So, and you're a lot of what was interesting is the way that you're talking about really large concerns, and then you're mapping out very detailed connections and so forth between people. And this is just a really, really minor curiosity. On this piece of paper you're showing us, what's going on in the right column? Right, it's clear that there are names over there, and I can see checks, and so who's coming, who's not. What's happening on the other side of the page?
So I think those are, actually I haven't decoded all of those initials. I think those are the people who were so well known to the person writing the invitation letter that they didn't need full names. So for instance, you'll see DF in the right-hand column. That's Darrell Ford. He was the longtime director of the International African Institute. He doesn't even need to be named. So it may be that amongst those initials there are even more, eminent, honored anthropologists of Africa who were invited to this party, and maybe, judging by the number of check marks, did attend.
Were there many documents of this sort that you looked at, or is this just an unusual example?
There wasn't a great deal in the Barbara Pym file, in the IAA papers. Barbara Pym's own papers are at the Bodleian in Oxford, and there are many boxes of them, and notebooks and drafts of her novels, and those are fascinating too. And I did use some of those as well. I was hoping for more, and I was hoping just for some of the kind of mundane office correspondence that no doubt she was handling every single day, where she writes to an author with suggestions for changes to their article that's going to appear in the journal Africa, which is the journal out of the Institute. And I didn't see too many of those. But the files of the IAA are enormous, and I certainly didn't go through them all. Alexander.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. So I'm a lot more familiar with the French context, and so when I hear literature and anthropology, I think of Vincent de Van's work, and his work on the French anthropologist being between science and fiction, kind of writing one book that's more scientific and one official.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, are you in dialogue with him at all?
Yeah, I discuss his work in the introduction, and that idea of the deuxième livre, that was a very striking difference between Anglophone and Francophone anthropology, that many Francophone anthropologists from the earliest days of the discipline would write a scholarly monograph which had, and there were very kind of strict rules about, how griots, first there has to be a survey of the climate, then there has to be the geography of the topography of the land, and I'm caricaturing a little bit, but a strong sense that there were clear genre rules about how that monograph should be done, and then a second book, which would be a more literary or memoiristic or a travel narrative, and I talk about that, but in the reverse, and with Larice, who wrote the travel book first, and then wrote the monographs later. So he's an interesting and odd figure in that respect. So yes, I am in dialogue with his work a little bit. I think it's excellent. I learned a lot about Francophone anthropology from reading his work. But I also think that in a way that, although that makes it seem as if the dialogue is kind of easier on the Francophone side, because these anthropologists were writing literary texts, in a way, by keeping them separate, you have the anthropological book and then you have the literary book. In a sense, you keep the disciplines from talking to each other a little bit more that way.
Well, I guess
potentially.
I was wondering, do you see in the Anglophone context a kind of different relationship happening, or is it something similar?
Well, James Clifford says that Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict had to hide their poems from Franz Boas. I don't know if that's true, but the idea that they had, so it was clear they had literary ambitions, but those there wasn't really a good outlet for them. So but Margaret Mead was a good writer. So even when she writes her UNESCO handbook, I can't even remember the title. The title is so boring that I can't even remember it. But the book itself is it's basically a handbook of what now we might call cultural competency. It's interestingly done and has these kind of literary flourishes to it, but the fact that the Bohannon was not able to publish this novel under her own name or didn't feel comfortable doing that seems to me to potentially suggest a quite significant injunction against literary ambition.
I think we have time for one more question.
Tracy?
So I don't want to toss a couple more books on your pile of, having thought about
Please
these
do.
guys. No, I won't. But thinking about these questions in a different context, in the Latin American context, about people who have gone either from literature to anthropology or vice versa, from anthropology to literature. If I had to generalize, I would ask questions kind of about authority to address certain questions on the one hand, and an audience on the other hand. And I would kind of place them maybe in opposite directions and say that some of the folks who move from literature to anthropology and seek formal training do so in order to position themselves with a certain kind of authority in an intellectual community with a scientific background that they wouldn't have otherwise, and so that they're taken seriously in projects of nation building and so forth.
Right.
And on the other hand, thinking more specifically about the Brazilian case, I would look at anthropologists who are very frustrated at the fact that nobody's reading their books and nobody is, knows anything about their field work, and they want to address a broader audience. And so they write novels, with the expectation or the hope that somebody else other than this very small subset of anthropologists is going to read what they have to say, and that somehow that will impact people's ways of thinking about their national community and so forth. And then, kind of out of that mess, advancing a couple decades forward, the question of the testimonial genre kind of appears as this, amorphous mix between those genres, in which the anthropologist kind of mediates between the community and an audience, but the position isn't quite clear and so forth.
Right.
And so I just wonder about kind of those questions of intention and audience and legitimacy on the one hand in this corpus, And if the question of genre and testimony then is somehow a consequence of these conflicts in the areas that you're studying.
I think that's a really fascinating question. I think the contexts and the genres available are a little bit different in the U.S. context and in the British context. Like I think for instance, I read a little bit about C.P. Snow and the idea of the two cultures. And Snow, who's a novelist, a very boring novelist, but a novelist, is frustrated that literary figures have a kind of unearned authority in the British context in the 50s, and that they look down on they're snobbish about scientists and engineers in particular, people with practical skills. And he says, this is ridiculous. Like, why should they be swanning around at high table at Oxford, looking down on people who actually are going to help transform the world into a better place? Mm-hmm. So in that context, so he's saying what we need are, it's a kind of NGO development project. He's like, well, we need people who are going to go out there and help people build water pumps, or that's the kind of practical know-how that we need, and we need scientists and technicians in order to do that. And we should stop listening to T.S. Eliot because he doesn't have anything to tell us, right? And I think in the U.S. context, these are big generalizations, but there is a popular audience for anthropologist intellectuals, or at least for a few, in the post-war period. So, Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture sells tens of thousands of copies and is widely read. Margaret Mead, even more so. They appeared on television. They wrote in newspapers. They had an audience, and they had a kind of political and cultural authority for the language of kind of sort of benevolent cultural anti-racism, basically. That's the lesson to learn from the catastrophes of World War II, and they'd earned that partly through working with the military during the war. So Benedict wrote a book about Japan and Japanese culture, which was also widely read.
Wonderful title too.
Yeah, the chrysanthemum and the rose. Chrysanthemum and the sword. That's right. Yeah. Margaret Mead wrote a kind of anthropology of the English in World War II called "And Keep Your Powder Dry." It's like explaining the English to Americans. So they had worked. They were part of the war effort. This was how they were. They were assisting the fight against fascism, and that gave them a certain kind of authority immediately after the war. So, I do say in the introduction that the Latin American context is, the large missing piece of the puzzle in my book, because I know from your work and from others that the conversation between anthropologists and writers in the Latin American context is really important, and in this period in particular. And I don't talk about it because I'm waiting for your book. That's not fair, I'm sorry.
So before we give another well-deserved round of applause, I'll just remind you that the books are for sale.
It's $37 a piece that way. Do the math in your head.